The alarm clock buzzed at 5 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 15 years. Captain Lisa Rodriguez rolled out of bed and looked at herself in the mirror. At 38 years old, she had more flight hours than most pilots twice her size, but that didn't stop the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. Walking into the mess hall that morning, she could feel the familiar stares. The other pilots glanced up from their coffee and breakfast, some nodding respectfully, others just watching. Lisa had earned her place here through countless hours of training, perfect test scores and flying missions that would make most people's hands shake just thinking about them. But still, she was different. In a world dominated by tall, broad-shouldered men with deep voices and confident swagger, she stood out like a flower in a field of concrete. The base was buzzing with excitement that week. Word had spread about the new experimental fighter jet that had just arrived. This wasn't just any ordinary aircraft. This was the future of military aviation, packed with technology that seemed like something out of a science fiction movie. The plane could fly faster, higher, and more efficiently than anything the military had ever built. Only the absolute best pilots would get a chance to test it. Lisa had been flying since she was 18 years old. She started with small training planes, then worked her way up through every type of aircraft the military had. She'd flown in storms that turned grown men pale, landed on aircraft carriers in rough seas, and navigated through mountains with visibility so poor she could barely see her own hands. Her record was spotless, her skills were undeniable, but none of that seemed to matter when she walked into rooms full of her male colleagues. The announcement came during the Monday morning briefing. Colonel Morrison, a man in his 50s with gray hair and a voice that could cut through steel, stood at the front of the room reading names from a list. These were the pilots chosen for the experimental aircraft testing program. Lisa listened as name after name was called out. Johnson, Peterson, Williams, Martinez. Her heart started to sink. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time they'd overlook her again despite her qualifications. Then she heard it. Rodriguez. Her name echoed through the briefing room, and she felt every eye turn toward her. Some faces showed surprise. Others showed something that looked like annoyance. A few pilots exchanged glances that clearly said what they were thinking. Really? Her? Colonel Morrison continued reading the safety protocols and technical specifications of the new aircraft. The plane was worth over $200 million. It had engines that could push it to speeds most pilots had never experienced. The navigation system was completely computerized, using satellites and advanced sensors that could detect obstacles miles away. The cockpit looked more like a spaceship than a traditional fighter jet, with screens and controls that required months of specialized training to master. After the briefing, Lisa made her way to the hangar where the new aircraft was housed. She'd seen pictures of it in technical manuals, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. The plane was sleek and angular, painted in a dark gray that seemed to absorb light. Its wings were swept back at a sharp angle, and the cockpit glass was tinted so dark you couldn't see inside. Everything about it screamed speed and power. Other pilots were already gathered around the aircraft, running their hands along its surface and peering into the cockpit. Lisa approached the group and the conversation gradually died down. She could feel the tension in the air, thick as humidity on a summer day. Well, came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Colonel Morrison approaching with a clipboard in his hand, and what could only be described as a smirk on his face. Look who made the list. The other pilot stepped back slightly, creating a small circle around Lisa and the colonel. She stood her ground, keeping her expression neutral despite the heat she felt rising in her cheeks. "I've been flying for 15 years, sir," Lisa said calmly. "My test scores were in the top 5% of all candidates." Colonel Morrison let out a laugh that wasn't entirely friendly. It was the kind of laugh that said he found something amusing that nobody else was supposed to understand. "Oh, I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were." He walked slowly around her like a drill sergeant inspecting a new recruit. "You know, Rodriguez, this isn't like the training planes you're used to. This machine has more power than anything you've ever touched. It responds differently, it thinks differently. Some pilots have spent their whole careers working up to something like this." Lisa felt her jaw tighten. She'd heard versions of this speech before. The underlying message was always the same. You don't belong here. You're not strong enough, not experienced enough, not the right type of person for this job. I understand. The responsibility, sir, she replied, keeping her voice steady. I've reviewed all the technical manuals and completed the simulator training. I'm ready for this. The colonel's laugh got a little louder. A few of the other pilots started to chuckle along with him. Simulator training, he repeated, shaking his head. That's cute, that's really cute. One of the other pilots, a tall man with arms covered in tattoos, stepped forward. Sir, maybe we should consider if Rodriguez is really the best choice for this program. I mean, no offense to her, but this aircraft requires a certain level of physical capability. Lisa felt her hands clench into fists at her sides. She'd heard this argument countless times. The idea that her smaller stature somehow made her less capable of controlling an aircraft was not only insulting, it was completely wrong. Some of the best pilots in aviation history had been smaller people who compensated with superior skill and intelligence. I appreciate your concern, Lisa said, looking directly at the tattooed pilot. But I think my flight record speaks for itself. Colonel Morrison held up his hand to quiet the growing murmur of conversation. Look, Rodriguez, nobody's questioning your dedication. But this is serious business. This aircraft represents the future of our entire air defense system. We can't afford to take chances just to make a political statement. The words hit Lisa like a slap in the face. A political statement. That's what they thought she was. Not a qualified pilot who had earned her place through years of hard work and proven skill. Just a symbol, a checkbox to fill some diversity requirement. She took a deep breath and looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some showed open skepticism. Others just looked uncomfortable, like they wanted to be anywhere else but in the middle of this conversation. A few seemed genuinely curious to see what would happen next. Colonel Morrison, Lisa said, her voice carrying clearly across the hangar. I didn't ask to be here to make any kind of statement. I'm here because I'm qualified. I'm here because I can fly this aircraft better than most people in this room. The silence that followed was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop on the concrete floor. Colonel Morrison's expression shifted slightly, like he was seeing her for the first time. We'll see about that, Rodriguez, he said finally. We'll see about that. As the group began to disperse, Lisa remained standing next to the experimental aircraft. She placed her hand on its smooth surface and felt the cool metal against her palm. This machine would either prove her right or end her career. There would be no middle ground. Looking up at the tinted cockpit glass, she made herself a promise. When she climbed into that pilot's seat, she wouldn't just fly this aircraft. She would master it. She would show everyone in that hangar, including Colonel Morrison, exactly what she was capable of. The next morning would bring the first test flight. Lisa had spent the entire night reviewing technical specifications and running through emergency procedures in her mind. She was as ready as anyone could be. But as she would soon discover, no amount of preparation could have prepared her for what was about to happen. The morning of the test flight started like any other. Lisa woke up before dawn, went through her usual routine of checking weather reports and aircraft specifications, and arrived at the hangar an hour early. The experimental fighter jet sat under the bright fluorescent lights, looking even more impressive than it had the day before. 3 other pilots had been scheduled for test flights that morning. Captain Williams would go first, followed by Lieutenant Peterson, then Major Johnson. Lisa was scheduled for the afternoon slot, which gave her plenty of time to watch the others and learn from their experiences. The weather forecast looked perfect. Clear skies, light winds, visibility for miles in every direction. The kind of day that pilots dream about for testing new aircraft. The meteorology team had given their approval, and even Colonel Morrison seemed to be in a good mood as he watched the pre-flight preparations. Williams climbed into the cockpit first, running through his checklist with the precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times before. The engine started with a low rumble that gradually built to a powerful roar. Lisa watched from the observation deck as the aircraft taxied down the runway, picked up speed, and lifted gracefully into the bright blue sky. For the next hour, Williams put the plane through a series of basic maneuvers: sharp turns, rapid climbs, controlled dives. Everything looked smooth and professional. When he landed, he was grinning from ear to ear, talking excitedly about how responsive the controls were and how stable the aircraft felt, even at high speeds. Peterson went next, pushing the aircraft a little harder, testing its limits at higher altitudes. Again, everything went perfectly. The plane performed exactly as the engineers had promised. Johnson's flight was equally successful, and by noon, everyone was feeling confident about the afternoon test session. Lisa spent her lunch break in the pilot ready room, reviewing flight plans and double-checking every detail of her planned route. She would be taking the aircraft on a longer flight than the previous pilots, testing some of the more advanced navigation systems over a wider area. Her route would take her north toward the mountains, then east over the desert, before circling back to base. At 2 p.m., she began her pre-flight inspection. Everything looked perfect. The aircraft had been refueled, all systems had been checked and rechecked, and the weather still looked ideal. Colonel Morrison watched from a distance as she went through her checklist, his expression unreadable. "Rodriguez," he called out as she prepared to climb into the cockpit. "Remember, this isn't a joyride. Stick to the flight plan, test what you're supposed to test, and get back here in one piece." "Yes, sir," Lisa replied, pulling on her helmet and adjusting her flight suit. "I'll see you in a few hours." The cockpit of the experimental aircraft was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Instead of traditional analog gauges, everything was displayed on high-resolution screens. The controls were more sensitive than any aircraft she had flown before, responding to the slightest touch. It was like driving a race car after spending years in a pickup truck. She started the engines and felt the incredible power vibrating through the entire aircraft. The sound was different too, deeper and more intense than conventional fighter jets. As she taxied toward the runway, she could see ground crew members stopping their work to watch. Word had spread quickly around the base that she would be flying the new prototype, and people were curious to see how she would handle it. The takeoff was smooth and exhilarating. The aircraft seemed to leap off the runway with barely any effort, climbing rapidly into the afternoon sky. Lisa felt a surge of pure joy as she gained altitude and began to appreciate just how advanced this machine really was. Every control input was translated instantly into precise movements. The aircraft felt like an extension of her own body. For the first 2 hours, everything went exactly according to plan. She tested various systems, ran through different flight patterns, and gradually pushed the aircraft to higher speeds and more aggressive maneuvers. The performance was incredible. This plane could do things that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. She was flying at about 30,000 feet, heading east toward the desert portion of her route, when she first noticed the clouds building on the horizon. They were still far away, but they looked darker and more threatening than anything the weather forecast had predicted. She checked her instruments and confirmed that she was still well within the safe zone of her planned route. 20 minutes later, those distant clouds had grown into towering thunderheads that stretched up into the sky like massive gray mountains. Lisa had seen storms before, but this one was developing with unusual speed and intensity. She radioed back to base to report what she was seeing. "Base, this is Rodriguez. I'm observing significant weather development to the northeast. Looks like a major storm system that wasn't in the forecast." The response crackled through her headset. "Rodriguez, we're tracking the same system. Weather Service says it came out of nowhere. Recommend you adjust your route to avoid the storm area." Lisa looked at her navigation display and calculated a new course that would take her around the storm. It would add about 30 minutes to her flight time, but that shouldn't be a problem. She had plenty of fuel, and the aircraft was performing perfectly. But as she began to turn away from the storm, she realized it was growing even faster than she had thought. The dark clouds were spreading in all directions, and what had started as a localized weather system was rapidly becoming a massive front that covered hundreds of square miles. "Base, the storm is expanding faster than I can navigate around it," she reported. "I'm going to need to either punch through it or find an alternate landing site." There was a pause before the response came back. Rodriguez, we strongly advise against flying through that system. Radar shows severe turbulence and possible hail. Recommend you head south and land at Peterson Air Force Base. Lisa checked her fuel gauge and did some quick calculations. Peterson was about 100 miles south of her current position. She had enough fuel to make it there comfortably, assuming the storm didn't force her to take an even longer detour. But as she turned south, she discovered that the storm had other plans. The weather system wasn't just growing outward. It was moving south as well, directly into her escape route. Within minutes, the sky around her began to darken as the leading edge of the storm caught up with her position. The first sign of trouble was the turbulence. What had been smooth, stable flight suddenly became a roller coaster ride as the aircraft was tossed around by increasingly violent air currents. Lisa gripped the controls tighter and tried to maintain level flight, but the storm was becoming more aggressive by the minute. Then the rain started. Not the gentle shower that pilots sometimes encounter, but sheets of water so thick it was like flying through a waterfall. Visibility dropped to almost 0 in seconds. Lisa could barely see the tip of her own wings, let alone navigate visually. She switched to instrument flight, relying entirely on the aircraft's electronic systems to tell her where she was and which direction she was heading. But that's when she discovered the storm's most dangerous characteristic. The massive electrical activity was interfering with her navigation equipment. The first system to fail was the GPS. The screen that had been showing her exact position just moments before suddenly went blank. Then the radio started crackling, with static, making communication with the base nearly impossible. One by one, the sophisticated electronic systems that made this aircraft so advanced began to malfunction. Lisa felt her heart rate increase as she realized the gravity of her situation. She was flying blind in a $200 million prototype aircraft, with storms all around her and her navigation systems failing. The fuel gauge still showed adequate reserves, but without reliable instruments, she couldn't be sure she was heading in the right direction. Through the static on her radio, she could barely make out voices from the base trying to contact her. Colonel Morrison's voice came through in fragments. Rodriguez. Respond. Emergency. Position. She tried to respond, but her transmission seemed to be getting lost in the electrical interference from the storm. For the first time in her 15-year flying career, Lisa felt truly alone in the sky. The aircraft shook violently as another wave of turbulence hit. Lightning flashed all around her, so close she could feel the electrical charge in the air. The sophisticated computer systems that were supposed to make flying safer were now working against her, confused by the electromagnetic chaos of the storm. Looking at her remaining functional instruments, Lisa realized she had a choice to make. She could try to climb above the storm, though that would use precious fuel and there was no guarantee the interference would be any better at higher altitude. Or she could descend and try to get below the worst of the weather, risking a dangerous, low-altitude flight in zero visibility conditions. Either way, she was running out of time and options. The storm had trapped her in a situation that no amount of training or preparation could have anticipated. As another bolt of lightning illuminated the cockpit, Lisa knew that the real test was just beginning. The storm had completely swallowed Lisa's aircraft. Outside the cockpit, everything was a wall of gray and black, with lightning flashing so frequently it looked like a deadly light show. The rain hammered against the canopy so hard she thought it might crack. But the real problem wasn't what she could see outside. It was what she couldn't see on her instrument panel. More systems were failing by the minute. The backup GPS had gone dark. The radar that was supposed to help her navigate around obstacles was showing nothing but static. Even the fuel gauge was giving her inconsistent readings, jumping between different numbers every few seconds. Lisa had trained for equipment failures before, but never anything like this. It was as if the storm was deliberately attacking every piece of technology that kept her connected to the ground. She tried the radio again, pressing the transmission button and speaking as clearly as she could through the turbulence. Base, this is Rodriguez. Multiple system failures. Navigation is down. I need assistance. The response came back as broken fragments through waves of static. Rodriguez. Hear you, Storm. Too strong, can't. That was it. Whatever connection she had with the ground was now completely severed. Lisa was alone in a multi-million-dollar aircraft that was quickly becoming as helpless as a paper airplane in a hurricane. She looked at the fuel indicator again. The numbers kept changing, but the general trend was clear. She was running low and fast. At her current speed and with the extra maneuvering the storm was forcing her to do, she had maybe 40 minutes of flight time left. Maybe less. 40 minutes to find a place to land an experimental fighter jet with failing systems in the middle of the worst storm she had ever encountered. Lisa forced herself to think clearly, despite the chaos around her. She mentally reviewed her flight path and tried to calculate where she might be. The storm had pushed her around so much that her dead reckoning was probably way off, but she had to start somewhere. If she was where she thought she was, there should be a civilian airport about 50 miles to the southeast. It was a small regional facility that mostly handled passenger jets and cargo planes, but it had a decent runway. The problem was finding it in zero visibility conditions, and then figuring out if she could actually land this military aircraft there safely. The alternative was trying to make it back to her home base, but that was at least 80 miles away, through the heart of the storm. With her fuel situation, that seemed impossible. She made her decision and banked the aircraft toward where she hoped the civilian airport would be. The turbulence was getting worse, and she had to fight the controls, constantly just to maintain level flight. Every few seconds the aircraft would drop suddenly as it hit an air pocket, then get slammed upward by the next gust of wind. 20 minutes later, Lisa was beginning to wonder if she had made the wrong choice. She should have reached the airport area by now, but she saw nothing below except the same gray soup that had been surrounding her for the past hour. Her fuel was getting critically low, and she was starting to consider the option that nobody wanted to think about: ejecting from the aircraft. It would mean losing a $200 million prototype, but more importantly, it would mean admitting defeat. Lisa could already imagine the investigation that would follow, the questions about whether she was really qualified for this mission, the suggestions that maybe someone else would have handled the situation better. But as she was weighing her options, something caught her eye through the storm. Just for a second, between the sheets of rain and the flashes of lightning, she thought she saw lights below. She banked the aircraft slightly and strained to see through the weather. There it was again. Definitely lights, arranged in the familiar pattern of a runway. She had found the civilian airport, though it was several miles from where she had expected it to be. Lisa felt a brief moment of relief, but it didn't last long. As she got closer to the airport, she could see the size of the runway. It was much shorter than what she was used to. Military runways were built for fast, heavy aircraft that needed plenty of space to land safely. This civilian strip looked like it was designed for much smaller planes. She circled the airport once, trying to assess the situation. The runway was maybe 6,000 feet long, which would normally be plenty for an experienced pilot in a conventional aircraft. But this wasn't a conventional aircraft. This was an experimental fighter jet loaded with advanced systems and materials that made it heavier than normal. And with the hydraulic systems acting up, she wasn't sure if the brakes would work properly. Through the static on her radio, she managed to pick up transmissions from the airport control tower. They had spotted her on their radar and were trying to communicate, but the storm was interfering with their equipment too. What she could make out wasn't encouraging. The control tower was advising her not to attempt a landing. The runway was too short for military aircraft, especially in these weather conditions. They were telling her to find an alternative, or to consider ejecting and letting the aircraft crash in an unpopulated area. Lisa looked at her fuel gauge one more time. The needle was dancing near empty. She didn't have enough fuel to reach another airport, and she certainly didn't have enough to wait for the storm to pass. It was now or never. But there was another problem she was just beginning to understand. The approach to this particular runway was complicated even in good weather. The airport was built in a valley, surrounded by hills on three sides. In normal conditions, pilots could see the terrain and navigate around the obstacles. But in this storm, with zero visibility, attempting to land here would be like trying to thread a needle while blindfolded. As if the situation wasn't challenging enough, more systems began to fail. The hydraulic pressure that controlled the aircraft's control surfaces started to drop. The flaps that she would normally use to slow down for landing were responding sluggishly. Even the landing gear warning light was flickering, making her wonder if the wheels would deploy properly when she needed them. Lisa took a deep breath and tried to clear her mind. She had been in difficult situations before, though nothing quite like this. In all her years of flying, she had learned that panic was the enemy of good decision-making. If she was going to get out of this alive, she needed to think like a pilot, not like someone who was scared. She started running through her options systematically. She could try a conventional approach to the runway, but with the short landing distance and unreliable brakes, there was a good chance she would overshoot and crash into whatever was at the far end of the airport. She could try to belly land, in a field somewhere, but in zero visibility she might hit trees, buildings, or power lines without knowing they were there, or she could attempt something that she had only read about in theoretical flight manuals, something that experienced pilots talked about in hushed tones but never actually tried because it was considered too dangerous. The idea was crazy enough that it just might work. Instead of fighting the storm, she could use it. The violent winds that were making her flight so difficult could actually help her if she approached them the right way. It would require precise timing, incredible skill, and more luck than anyone had a right to expect. But looking at her fuel gauge and listening to the engine's changing tone as it started to run lean, Lisa realized she was out of conventional options. Through the crackling radio, she heard Colonel Morrison's voice trying to reach her. "Rodriguez, if you can hear this, we're ordering you to eject immediately. Do not attempt to land that aircraft. I repeat, eject now." Lisa reached for her radio transmitter one last time. She wasn't sure if her message would get through, but she had to try. "Base, this is Rodriguez. I'm going to attempt an emergency landing. If this doesn't work, tell everyone that I tried to bring her home." She switched off the radio and focused entirely on what she was about to attempt. In a few minutes, she would either pull off the most remarkable landing in aviation history or become a cautionary tale that flight instructors would tell for years to come. The storm raged around her as she lined up for her final approach, preparing to bet everything on a maneuver that existed only in theory. Lisa had maybe 10 minutes of fuel left, and she was about to attempt something that had never been done before. The theoretical maneuver she remembered from advanced flight training was called a storm approach, and it existed only on paper, because every instructor who taught it made sure to emphasize that no pilot should ever be crazy enough to try it in real life. The concept was simple in theory, but nearly impossible in practice. Instead of fighting against the violent wind currents created by the thunderstorm, a pilot could theoretically use those same currents to slow down an aircraft that was coming in too fast for a short runway. It would mean flying directly into the heart of the storm's turbulence, using the chaotic air currents like invisible brakes. But the timing had to be perfect. The pilot would need to understand exactly how the wind was moving at different altitudes, calculate the aircraft's speed and descent rate in real time, and make precise control adjustments every few seconds. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the aircraft would either be torn apart by the turbulence or slammed into the ground at fatal speed. Lisa circled the airport one more time, studying the storm patterns around her. The lightning was so frequent now that it provided almost continuous illumination, giving her brief glimpses of the terrain below. She could see the runway lights cutting through the darkness like a narrow ribbon of hope. The wind was coming from the southwest, which meant she would need to approach from the northeast to take advantage of the headwind. But the hills surrounding the airport made that approach even more dangerous. She would have to fly lower than normal, threading between obstacles she could barely see, while managing the violent air currents that were bouncing her aircraft around like a toy. She lined up for her approach, dropping her altitude and reducing power. The aircraft immediately started shaking more violently as it hit the worst of the turbulence near the ground. Lisa gripped the controls with both hands, making constant tiny adjustments to keep the plane on course. At 3,000 feet above the runway, she encountered the first major downdraft. The aircraft suddenly dropped 200 feet in seconds, as if an invisible hand had yanked it toward the earth. Lisa fought to regain altitude, but she didn't fight too hard. This was part of what she was counting on. She needed the storm to help slow her down. The key was reading the air currents like a surfer reads waves. When a downdraft hit, she would use it to reduce her altitude while maintaining forward speed. When an updraft caught the aircraft, she would use the upward momentum to trade speed for height, bleeding off the excess velocity that would make landing impossible. At 2,000 feet, Lisa deployed the landing gear. The wheels came down with a reassuring thunk, but the extra drag immediately made the aircraft less stable in the turbulent air. She had to work even harder now to maintain control, making constant corrections as gusts of wind tried to push her off course. The runway was directly ahead, but it looked impossibly small from her current altitude and speed. Lisa was still coming in too fast, even with the storm's help. She needed to lose more speed, and she needed to do it in the next 60 seconds. She spotted what she was looking for at 1,500 feet. A massive updraft was developing directly in front of her, the kind of violent air current that would normally be every pilot's nightmare. But Lisa flew directly into it, using the upward force to lift the nose of her aircraft while simultaneously reducing engine power. The maneuver worked exactly as she had hoped. The aircraft shot upward for several seconds, trading forward speed for altitude. Then, as the updraft weakened, she pushed the nose down and let gravity help slow her descent rate. She was essentially using the storm's own energy to control her approach, but the turbulence was getting worse. At 1,000 feet, a sideways gust nearly flipped the aircraft completely over. Lisa had to use full rudder and aileron control to keep the wings level. The strain on the aircraft's structure was enormous. She could hear metal groaning and feel the whole plane flexing under forces it was never designed to handle. The experimental fighter jet had been built for speed and precision, not for this kind of punishment, but somehow it was holding together. At 500 feet, Lisa could finally see the runway clearly. It looked even shorter than she had remembered, with buildings and trees uncomfortably close to both ends. The approach lights were barely visible through the sheets of rain, but they gave her a reference point to aim for. She was still coming in too fast, but she was running out of altitude to bleed off more speed. This was where the most dangerous part of her plan came into play. She would have to time her final descent to coincide with one more downdraft, using the storm's power to slam her onto the runway at exactly the right moment. At 300 feet, she found what she was looking for. A massive downdraft was forming directly over the runway approach, the kind that would normally send an aircraft crashing to the ground. But Lisa flew directly into it, using the downward force to accelerate her descent while simultaneously raising the nose to maintain the proper landing attitude. The aircraft hit the downdraft like a brick wall. For a terrifying moment, Lisa felt completely out of control as the plane was hammered toward the runway. But she had calculated correctly. The violent, downward air current was providing exactly the force she needed to get the aircraft on the ground quickly. At 100 feet, she could see people on the ground. Airport emergency crews had positioned themselves along the runway, their vehicles' lights cutting through the storm. They were expecting a disaster. Everyone who understood aviation knew that what she was attempting was impossible. At 50 feet, Lisa pulled back slightly on the controls, flaring the aircraft to slow its descent rate. This was the moment of truth. If she had misjudged the storm currents, if her timing was off by even a few seconds, the aircraft would either bounce off the runway and cartwheel into the surrounding terrain, or hit so hard that the landing gear would collapse. The main wheels touched down with a tremendous crash that Lisa felt through her entire body. The aircraft bounced once, twice, then settled onto the runway with the groaning sound of metal being pushed to its absolute limits. But she was down. Now came the second impossible part. She had to stop the aircraft before running out of runway. Lisa immediately deployed the drag chute and applied maximum braking, but the runway was slick with rain and the brakes were responding poorly due to the hydraulic problems. The aircraft was still traveling at dangerous speed, eating up precious runway with every second. The far end of the runway was approaching fast. Lisa could see the lights of buildings beyond the airport boundary. If she couldn't stop in time, she would crash into whatever was at the end of the strip at over 100 miles per hour. She tried everything she could think of. Full brakes, maximum reverse thrust from the engines, even steering the aircraft slightly side to side to create more drag. The experimental fighter was fighting her every step of the way, its advanced systems confused by the electrical interference from the storm. With less than 500 feet of runway remaining, Lisa made one final desperate move. She deliberately ground-looped the aircraft using the landing gear and the aircraft's own momentum to spin it sideways on the runway. It was incredibly dangerous and would probably damage the plane, but it was better than flying off the end of the runway at high speed. The maneuver worked. The aircraft spun 90 degrees and came to a stop with less than 100 feet of runway to spare. Lisa sat in the cockpit for a moment, hardly believing she was alive. The storm was still raging around her, but she was on the ground, in one piece, and the $200 million prototype was damaged but intact. She shut down the engines and listened to the rain hammering on the canopy above her head. Through the storm, she could see emergency vehicles racing toward her position, their lights flashing in the darkness. Lisa had just accomplished something that aviation experts would later say was aerodynamically impossible. She had used the storm that nearly killed her as a tool for survival, turning the chaotic forces of nature into precision flight controls. But she didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she had brought the aircraft home. Lisa sat in the cockpit for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Her hands were still gripping the controls, even though the engines were silent and the aircraft was completely still. The adrenaline that had carried her through, the impossible landing was starting to wear off, and she was beginning to realize just how close she had come to disaster. The storm was already starting to weaken. The lightning was less frequent, and the rain was beginning to lighten from the torrential downpour that had made her flight so dangerous. Through the canopy, she could see emergency vehicles surrounding her aircraft, their red and blue lights flashing in the darkness. The first person to reach her was a fire chief from the local airport emergency crew. He climbed up on a ladder that his team had positioned next to the cockpit and tapped on the glass. Lisa popped the canopy release, and the clear cover lifted with a hydraulic hiss. "Ma'am, are you injured?" the fire chief asked, his voice barely audible over the wind and rain. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen in 30 years of airport operations." Lisa shook her head, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was hurt or not. Her body felt like she had been in a car accident, every muscle aching from the strain of fighting the controls for so long. But nothing seemed to be broken. "I'm okay," she said, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Is the aircraft secure?" "Don't worry about the plane right now," the fire chief replied. "Let's get you out of there and checked by the medical team." As Lisa climbed down from the cockpit, she got her first good look at the aircraft from the outside. The experimental fighter looked like it had been through a war. The paint was scratched and dented from the hail. One of the wingtips had been bent slightly during the violent landing. The landing gear looked stressed and damaged from the hard impact with the runway, but it was still in one piece. The $200 million prototype that everyone had expected her to lose was sitting on the tarmac, damaged but salvageable. Word of the emergency landing spread quickly. Within an hour, the small civilian airport was buzzing with activity. Military vehicles began arriving from the nearby Air Force base. Reporters had somehow gotten wind of the story and were setting up cameras outside the airport fence. Aviation experts were calling colleagues to share the news of what was already being described as an impossible feat of flying. Lisa was in the airport medical facility, being checked over by a doctor, when Colonel Morrison arrived. She could hear his voice in the hallway before she saw him, talking rapidly on his phone about damage assessments and accident investigations. When he walked into the medical room, his expression was unlike anything she had seen from him before. "Rodriguez," he said, and then stopped. For a moment, the man who always had something to say seemed to be at a loss for words. "I owe you an apology." Lisa looked up from the examination table where the doctor was checking her blood pressure. "Sir?" Colonel Morrison pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. He suddenly looked older than his years, like someone who had just been forced to reconsider everything he thought he knew. "I've been flying for 25 years, he said slowly. "I've seen pilots do things that seemed impossible. But what you did out there tonight, I've never seen anything like it. Hell, I've never heard of anything like it." The doctor finished his examination and declared that Lisa was physically fine, just exhausted and slightly dehydrated. As he left the room, Colonel Morrison continued talking. The meteorology team ran the numbers on that storm. The wind speeds you were flying through should have torn any aircraft apart. The downdrafts you used for your approach were measuring over 3,000 feet per minute. That's enough force to crush a normal plane like a tin can. Lisa nodded. She was still processing what had happened herself. I just used what the storm gave me, sir. The theory was sound even if nobody had ever tried it before. Theory? Colonel Morrison laughed, but it wasn't the dismissive laugh she had heard from him before. This time it sounded almost amazed. Rodriguez, you took a theoretical maneuver that exists only in textbooks and used it to save a prototype aircraft that half the aviation industry said couldn't be saved. Do you understand what that means? Before Lisa could answer, the door opened and several more people entered the room. She recognized some of them as senior officers from her base, but others were wearing civilian clothes and carrying briefcases. One woman introduced herself as Dr. Chen, an aeronautical engineer from the company that had built the experimental aircraft. Captain Rodriguez, Dr. Chen said, we need to understand exactly how you executed that landing. The telemetry data from the aircraft shows flight patterns that we didn't think were possible. Over the next several hours, Lisa found herself describing her flight in detail to a growing audience of military officials, engineers, and aviation experts. They asked her to explain her decision-making process, her understanding of the storm, dynamics, and the precise control inputs she had used during the approach. What surprised her most was how they listened. These were people who had spent their entire careers studying flight dynamics and aircraft design, and they were hanging on every word she said. They weren't questioning whether she was qualified or whether she belonged in that cockpit. They were treating her like the expert she had always known herself to be. Dr. Chen was particularly interested in the storm approach technique. This could revolutionize emergency landing procedures, she explained. If pilots can be trained to use severe weather as a tool rather than just an obstacle, it could save lives and aircraft in situations that are currently considered hopeless. The story made national news within days. Aviation magazines ran detailed analyses of the flight with headlines calling it "The Landing That Rewrote the Rules and When Physics Met Courage." Flight schools began studying Lisa's technique, and the storm approach method started appearing in advanced pilot training manuals. But the real change wasn't in the textbooks or the headlines. It was in the way people looked at Lisa when she returned to her home base a week later. The whispers and skeptical glances were gone, replaced by something she had never experienced before: genuine respect from every pilot on the base. Young pilots, both male and female, started approaching her for advice. They wanted to know how she had developed such precise control skills, how she had learned to read weather patterns so accurately, and most importantly, how she had found the courage to attempt something that everyone said was impossible. Colonel Morrison became one of her strongest advocates. Within 6 months, he recommended her for promotion to major, citing not just her exceptional flying skills, but her innovative thinking and ability to perform under extreme pressure. The promotion came through faster than anyone expected. The experimental aircraft was repaired and returned to service, but with modifications based on what Lisa had learned during her emergency flight. The engineers strengthened several systems that had failed during the storm and improved the aircraft's ability to handle extreme weather conditions. More importantly, Lisa's storm approach technique became standard emergency training for military pilots worldwide. Flight simulators were programmed with storm scenarios, and pilots learned to use the same principles Lisa had discovered in real time during her emergency. 2 years later, a cargo pilot in Alaska used a modified version of Lisa's technique to land safely during a blizzard that had grounded all other aircraft. A Navy pilot successfully brought a damaged fighter jet home by using storm currents to compensate for failed control surfaces. Each time the technique was used successfully, Lisa received a note of thanks from the pilot who had survived because of something she had figured out during the worst flight of her life. Lisa eventually became the youngest woman ever promoted to lieutenant colonel in her squadron. She went on to lead the test pilot program for the next generation of experimental aircraft, and her opinions on aircraft design became highly valued throughout the aviation industry. But perhaps more importantly, Her story became proof that excellence has nothing to do with fitting a particular image or meeting traditional expectations. It has everything to do with skill, determination, and the courage to attempt the impossible when everything is on the line. Years later, when young pilots asked her about that night in the storm, Lisa always told them the same thing. "I didn't do anything that any other qualified pilot couldn't have done. I just refused to give up when everyone expected me to fail." The experimental fighter jet she had saved that night went on to become the foundation for an entire new generation of military aircraft. And every pilot who flew those planes knew they were flying technology that existed, because one small woman had proved that the impossible was just another word for something that hadn't been done yet.